is at war. In the previous year, Germany and its allies had occupied Poland, France, and the lowlands. Now they've expanded into North Africa, Greece, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. Britain, still unoccupied, has suffered tremendously from Nazi bombing. More than 400 bombs fell on London in the first night of the bombing on October 7, 1940, and nearly 2,000 in the first week alone. By the time the Blitz ended in June of 1941, no neighborhood in London was spared. Other major cities experienced a similar fate. To protect the civilian population, children were sent to the countryside. Though protected from bombs, they were not safe from the Nazi war machine. If he couldn't conquer Britain directly using his military might, Hitler decided he would starve its citizens into submission. German U-boats fanned out across the Atlantic, destroying every supply ship they could. England was facing a severe shortage of supplies, and strict rationing was in effect. It was under these dire conditions that a call rang out from radios across America. Lord Woolton, the British Minister of Food, implored the Allies.
Won't you people in the Americas do without cream in your coffee just one day a week so little children here can have milk?
The call was heard and answered by an extraordinary Canadian, Hal Rogers, the founder of the Association of Kinsmen Clubs of Canada, now known as Kincanada. Hal was a veteran of World War I. He missed the camaraderie and service he found in the army and founded Kin. By the time Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, there was a Kinsmen Club in every province and major city in Canada, and Newfoundland, which was still a separate country. As Britain declared war on September 3, 1939, Canada quickly followed. The urgency of the situation was not lost on the Kinsmen. They canceled their annual convention and immediately formed a National War Services Committee, naming Hal as the chairman. Each club was to provide $5 to the committee for their efforts. Hal immediately conscripted Jack Houston as treasurer. He was initially reluctant, but Hal convinced him to take the role by assuring him that all he had to do was bank the $5 per club and oversee the disbursement of the funds. In the early days, clubs ran their own individual fundraising drives and events. The successful ones were publicized in the Kin magazine, and other clubs took up some of the more popular approaches. One such event was the popular Help Lick Hitler stamps, started by the Halifax Club, which the War Services Committee quickly embraced as a national fundraising effort. The stamps were so popular that Hal received a threatening letter from an American Nazi sympathizer. In addition to collecting funds, the Kinsmen Club also collected magazines throughout the war. The mags, as they were referred to, were destined for the sailors of the merchant marines who desperately needed anything to take their minds off their treacherous journey across the Atlantic.
I met a young chap carrying a bundle of those magazines off to his ship. And I stopped him and I said, how important does that reading matter to you fellas? Anyway, out there was so much to do. And he said, mister, we have nothing to do except sit there on those funny old ships day in and day out for 10 or 12 or even 15 days, wondering when the torpedo's going to get us.
Although officially a Kinsmen Club effort, most of the collecting was done by the wives of the Kinsmen, today known as Kinettes. The mags were collected all over the country in such great numbers that they were measured in tons. The Kinettes stopped the counting when they reached 22 million magazines in 1942, but collections continued throughout the war. Although their efforts were met with great success, Hal and the War Services Committee knew that the Kinsmen had much more to offer. This is when Lord Woolton's famed radio appeal became the Kinsmen's rallying cry. Hal immediately made the call to the British Embassy in Ottawa and offered assistance, which was met with a surprisingly dismissive tone. Unflappable, Hal promised 1.5 million quarts of milk in 12 months and hung up. At first, daunted by the commitment, he was unsure how it would go over at the 1941 National Convention. But he had the help of a great photograph that eventually became the iconic image of Milk for Britain, a small boy with a bandaged head asking for some milk. The Kinsmen at the convention were 100% behind it, and the rest of Canada was soon to follow. Soon the milk money was collected nearly everywhere. Donated milk bottles were accompanied by cards bearing the hungry little face. Milkmen collected money during their daily runs. Banks and other businesses had collection bottles on their counters. Kin clubs held tag days, during which they collected funds and tagged those who had donated. The National Committee also organized the Halloween Shellout, with kids collecting funds for Milk for Britain instead of candies. There were as many imaginative approaches to raising funds as there were kin clubs. Some clubs built and raffled houses. Others held auctions of various items or different types of competitions. The contribution of the wives of the Kinsmen to the fundraising effort cannot be overlooked. They formed Kinette auxiliary clubs to support the Milk for Britain campaign and kept in stride with the Kinsmen every step of the way, holding their own fundraisers while continuing to support the Kinsmen efforts. The Kinsmen also inspired other Canadians to step up to the challenge, even if they had no connection to the Kinsmen or to Britain. Tom Semple was 71 when, by complete chance, Hal Rogers walked into a Montreal nightclub where he was the washroom attendant in 1943. He had been collecting donations for a year. When Hal introduced himself, Tom immediately handed over the bottle on his counter. He then opened a cupboard to reveal a whole stack of bottles filled with change totaling almost $600. Tom didn't mind that the donations were cutting into his tips, his sole source of income, and was happy to give even more. Despite their fundraising success, the War Services Committee faced great challenges when it came to buying and transporting the milk, no easy tasks during wartime rations. The milk was supplied in dried form. Initially, the Kinsmen supplied whole milk, but were soon told by the Canadian government that none was available as they had committed to sending all their supplies of whole milk to Allied prisoners of war. Undaunted, the Kinsmen switched over to skim milk, which was a new product at the time, but ran into another issue. The children in Britain were not used to this new skim milk, and a reticent request was made from Britain to consider adding cocoa and sugar to the milk powder. The Kinsmen happily complied, and soon the British children were receiving shipments of chocolate milk. To support Milk for Britain, the War Services Committee created promotional materials like ads, posters, and newsreels, which were made available to all the clubs. They obtained free advertising space in newspapers. The campaign also received essential support from partner organizations, like the milk producers, who supplied their product at cost, and national railway companies that provided their services for free. Milk for Britain was a truly consolidated national effort. The powdered milk traveled by rail to Halifax, and then by ship to Britain. Of all the shipments, only 2 carloads were lost when the ships carrying them were sunk. With Nazi U-boats crisscrossing the northern Atlantic, such small losses were near miraculous. The success of the Kinsmen's Milk for Britain project was in part due to the close relationship that developed with the Women's Voluntary Services of Britain, which distributed milk in the United Kingdom. The WVS was founded by Lady Stella Redding and eventually renamed the Women's Royal Voluntary Service. It still exists today. Kinsmen were the sole providers of milk throughout the war, according to Elsa Dunbar, CBE, who was in charge of logistics and distribution of supplies in Britain. The WVS members recycled the Kinsmen Milk for Britain powdered milk containers and used them to transport hot meals to their disadvantaged neighbors. This was the beginning of a global nutrition program for senior citizens that we now know as Meals on Wheels. Most British children had been evacuated to the countryside, and their caretakers were grateful for every ounce of milk they could get, as shortages and rationing restrictions made providing nutritious meals difficult. In some cases, during prolonged bouts of bombing, stores of Kinsmen powdered milk were the only source of nutrition for days at a time. Both the caretakers and their charges were grateful, and Kinsmen were overwhelmed with letters of gratitude. Though there was little to go around, the Women's Voluntary Service was generous with those in need. Elsa Dunbar wrote to the Kinsmen asking for their understanding, as she had distributed the milk to some adults, even though the milk was meant specifically for children. The adults she was referring to were Canadian servicemen who had been blinded in action and were recovering in a British hospital. The Kinsmen, of course, approved. The tremendous effort of the Kinsmen in executing the Milk for Britain campaign was echoed in the response of Canadians. the initial promise of 1.5 million quarts in 12 months turned into 4 million quarts by September 1942. With each year of the war, the Kinsmen increased the donated funds and shipments of milk. The campaign officially ended on August 31, 1945. By this point, they had raised enough money to purchase the maximum amount of milk allowed by the government, not just for 1945, but for 1946 as well. The purchasing continued into 1948, when all the money collected into the Milk for Britain Fund was expended, and the hard-working Jack Houston, who was only supposed to oversee a few $100s, had accounted for the collection and expenditure of $2,618,236.25 from the fund. Milk for Britain provided nourishment and support to the British people, and assurance that in their hour of greatest need, they were not alone. The Milk for Britain campaign was followed by a Food for Britain campaign. Together, the two campaigns led to Meals on Wheels, which still delivers more than 1.6 million meals to the elderly every year. In recognition of the key role he played in the campaign, Mr. Rogers was made an officer of the Civil Division of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire by King George VI in 1946. Nearly 30 years later, he was also invested as an officer in the Order of Canada. He accepted both honors with characteristic humility on behalf of all the Kinsmen and Kinettes. This wartime effort helped found 41 new Kinsmen clubs and the formation of a new women's branch of the organization, Kinettes. Most importantly, the Milk for Britain campaign demonstrated the immense capabilities of the Kinsmen and Kinettes, which established them as Canada's Service Club Association.